back to slide 98, the 18 to 25 demographic...
Put that away, Amy. The answers are here.
Leaving your business decisions up to destiny?
Reply hazy. Try again. Could be the Bluetooth interrupting the connection. I'd recommend aligning with your spirit guides.
The 18 to 25...
Ah, yes. It says yes. Maybe try meditation, Zoe.
There's no substitute for healthy data. Talent.
Hello and welcome back to TLC TV, the technology entertainment show brought to you by the Technology Leaders Club. On this episode, we are joined by Rob Smedley, CEO and founder of Smedley Group, Jason Pekethman, Chief Product Officer at Talent, and Dr. Ashley Cairns, Delivery Director at Carruthers & Jackson. Hello, today's episode is all about data. As the workplace landscape continues to evolve, many organizations look to scale back wherever possible. With the value of data often underestimated, data teams are finding their products relegated to the pit lane. But is now the best time to put the brakes on data investment? Or is it time to put the pedal to the metal and use data to pick up speed and accelerate out of the curve? Decision-making, future planning, problem-solving, market analysis, data sits at the center of every important business decision. Gathering data to help you better understand your customers and business is easier than ever. But in order to take full advantage of analytics, you need to get the most value from your data. If you don't know how to drive value from your data, it's as useful as having a handbrake in a canoe. So what does that mean? Discussing this with me today, once again, we have guests Rob Smedley, Jason Pekethman, and Dr. Ashley Cairns. Hello and welcome. How is everyone doing?
Good, really good.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. Now, before we go into the nitty-gritty of data, we'd like to take a few minutes just to get to know the panel as people. So, Ashley, Dr. Ashley Cairns. Now, it says doctor, PhD, not medical professional.
Important distinction.
Right. Has this ever been confused like a life and death situation?
It hasn't actually happened, but I do live in a sort of general fear that sooner or later I'm going to be on a plane or in a situation where someone shouts there's a doctor and someone's going to say, yeah, she's a doctor, and I'm going to have to deal with someone in a significant medical situation that I can't help with.
Because it's a lot of work for a PhD. Like, so if I had actually done that amount of work, no matter what the situation is, if anyone screams out, is there a doctor around, I'm putting my hand up.
Well, that's the thing, because quite often, as a woman as well, I spend a lot of my time having to correct people going, no, it's Dr. Ashley Cairns, because I'm that person, sorry everybody. So normally people say doctor, I want to go, yeah, doctor, but then you have to go, oh, no, not this time.
Yeah, you have to be proud of it. I would tell everyone and then explain the difference between the two whilst that person was dying.
Like, sorry,
in front
while you're
of me.
having a heart attack, I just need to explain.
If you could just listen for one moment.
So if you had a data problem, I'd be really good.
Jason, now there's several things that I read about you that I really liked. You're a musician, producer. You play several instruments. You're a certified paramedic as well. But you're also an ultra runner. Why would you? What's the longest you've? Basically, I'm not going to lie. I do detest anyone that does things like a fun run. Fun and run shouldn't be in the same sentence, let alone next to each other. What's the longest distance you've completed?
50 miles, 80 kilometres. Yeah.
No one here likes you. 50, 80 kilometres?
Yeah.
I don't even like driving 80 kilometres. How was that?
Tiring, I guess, long. But you get into a groove. I think the first 20 miles are the hardest. And then after that, you basically just run in chunks and just accomplish, like 5 miles, 10 miles at a time.
You're not selling this anyway. The first 20 miles, I was like the first 20 minutes of the worst. 20 miles. How long does that take you to do then?
Well, for that 50, I've done a couple of them. The one I did most recently, I actually did on my 50th birthday. It was a 50th birthday to myself present, so to die of a heart attack at the end. Anyway, but it took 11 hours, including time to break. So the actual running time was 10 hours, but I, stopped at 20, 30, 40 miles to eat something and drink and then get going again.
And you did one as a 50th birthday present for yourself?
That's correct, yeah.
I am never coming to one of your parties.
through the desert. It was fun.
Gosh, Rob Smedley, founder of the Smedley Group. How long has that been going?
7 years.
7 years. So in a elevator pitch, what is the Smedley Group?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. We've got that big, that quick, that we do all sorts. We do... So a lot of it is coming from the stuff that I did in Formula One. Mm-hmm. So we've got a data analytics business, and we're very involved in sports analytics for media purposes. We're very involved in data strategies for businesses, and then I do a lot of stuff with physically producing stuff, like an engineering and technology business. We do electric go-karts for kids, trying to get more kids from more underprivileged backgrounds involved in sport, that type of stuff, STEM education. I don't know, I sit there in most ExCo meetings and think, when did we start doing that? I can't remember that. We do a lot of stuff.
And one of the interesting facts I have about you is you once managed to bag 3rd place in the USA GP because you were incapacitated during a frantic wet-dry period of the GP. Now, what does all of that mean?
So what that means is when I was a young lad and I worked for a team called Jordan Grand Prix, which was run by, it was the eponymous team of a guy called Eddie Jordan. So anyone who's watched Formula One knows Eddie Jordan. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the Jordan Grand Prix team was reasonably successful. It was a little team. And I worked at the Jordan Grand Prix team, and I was race engineer, so which means you are the lead engineer on one of the cars. And at that point, we weren't particularly successful. We were at the US Grand Prix, and it was a dry period, and then it started to rain. So what happens when it rains is, in Formula One races, all the cars come in and they change to wet tyres. Now, it was one of those situations where it was a little bit wet, a little bit dry, and I was wondering what to do. And the technical director, who was, he was a guy about your size, and don't forget, I was quite a few kilos less than what I am now. I was in my early 20s, and he was a big Irish guy. And he kind of made it clear that I needed to make a decision, and quite quick, about whether we were going to pit the car or not. And then, because I didn't make a decision, he demonstrated his displeasure with me by punching me in the back. This was a different Formula One. And I basically got completely incapacitated because he's a massive guy, and sat out this whole pantomime of about 10 minutes during this Formula One race where cars were pitting, cars were not pitting, and we did absolutely nothing. Like, my driver was just going round and round in circles and went from like 20th to 3rd. And then at the end of the race, he said, "That was really good." And I went, "Well, we didn't really do a lot after you knocked me out."
Were you out cold?
No, I wasn't out cold. He hit me in the back. He kind of, to him, it was a playful. It wasn't a playful punch. It was a punch to say, you got to hurry up. I'm not sure that goes on in industry anymore, to be honest. I think the world's changed slightly.
Now that we've gotten to know our panellists a little better, let's dive straight into the conversation of data. So the first question this is to Jason. How has the unsteady economic environment and global uncertainty altered your relationship with data?
Well, yes, that's interesting, right? I think with data, obviously we want to be data-driven. And if you're data-driven, I think whenever there's some sort of crisis, you're basically looking at what your baseline data should be, and then what the change in that data is, and then running models on that data to determine, what is the next outcome, right?
So what would be like an example of a situation where you would need to be data-driven and using that data to make a decision?
So one example I can think of was actually during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we all drive cars, and during that pandemic, we drove a lot less. And insurance companies were then trying to model their data on, people are driving less, and so the risk profile changes for the drivers. And so you would think that our premiums would go down. And that happened in a few cases. But the interesting fact is, even though people were driving less, in the US, the fatality rate increased by 18% from 2020 to 2021. So 18% increase in fatalities, even though people were driving less. And that was because people drive faster when there's less cars on the road. Traffic wasn't slowing them down, and people saw an open freeway like everything was the Autobahn with nothing on it. And there were a lot more fatalities. And so when it comes to data, it's a similar sort of thing. It's like, are you collecting the right kind of data? Are your assumptions about what has happened previously still holding true? And when you do your risk assessment and your models, are they taking those factors into consideration? A lot of people wouldn't have imagined that that would have been the case. They would have thought fatalities will for sure go down. And it was the opposite. So I think, in uncertain economic times, I think you have to do a gut check to are you collecting the right data, and are the assumptions in the models that you have from your data-driven decisions still holding true?
Actually, I wanted to ask, with your business, how does data play its role within your business?
So I'm in consultancy, so I work across lots of different businesses. So data is really different depending on the organisation you're in, but it's clearly central to everything that you're doing. So I work with some finance companies, so obviously very much looking at, how much money can we spend in different places, what can we do with it. But recently, and I'll talk a lot more about charities because I'm working a lot with not-for-profits at the moment, it's really interesting because data for them isn't about money, which is really what we think about quite, first thing when we think about data is what's the ROI, what are we looking at? For charities, a lot of it is about how are we spending our money better and how are we serving our beneficiaries as well. So it's all about making sure, particularly if we link back to the uncertain times, how are we going to, it's going to cost us more to do what we already do this year than it did last year, which has never been, that's not been the case for a very long time. So how do we still continue to serve all these people that are at need while actually trying to save money? And data is central to that. If you know where you can make savings, where you can actually build services together, that will make a difference.
Okay. And coming to you, Rob, what role does data play in helping you meet and beat performance expectations? So we see it a lot. Every time the Red Sox, so I don't know too much about F1, but every time I watch it, there's someone at a screen looking at something. And so how does data in general help you guys outmatch other people's performance?
I think Formula One is undoubtedly the most data-driven sport on the planet. It might even be the most data-driven industry on the planet. So for a long time now, if you go back, the data journey in Formula One probably started 25, 30 years ago, something like that. And we understood as an industry, it was probably my generation coming into Formula One, that we could use all of these data points coming off the cars and data points coming from the environment around the track, and that could help us to understand a lot more about the performance. And if you can understand a lot more about the performance of the car and of your competitors, then that helps you to make more rational, sane decisions that drive better outcomes. So in Formula One terms, the ROI is lap time. You're constantly just trying to drive towards a better lap time, a faster lap time for the Formula One car. And I think then since then, there's a lot of different modelling techniques. We were very early adopters in Formula One of AI and ML, machine learning, in order to help us to drive the less deterministic outputs, to drive the stuff that the outcomes where you'd say, I wasn't expecting that answer from the data. So what does that mean? And that then takes you down a different development path, perhaps an untapped area of development where there will be a big return, big ROI, which is lap time. So we use a lot of simulation, a lot of modelling, dynamic simulation, quasi-static simulation, that type of stuff. And we then say, right, well, what is an optimized position for this car? How do you get, there's literally thousands of different parameters on a Formula One car. So how do you optimize all of that? And that's a combination of dynamic simulation, of machine learning. You put them models together, statistical analysis. They say, here's my optimized position. And then you feed in your real-time data and you say, where do I sit against that optimized position? And that then drives, an outcome and decision making for the people who drive performance on the car. So it's a constant loop. We deploy and utilize data at a very, very detailed level, and probably quite far ahead, because of how competitive Formula One is, quite far ahead of the technology curve as well. But it's an interesting journey. We're constantly improving and constantly looking for new technology.
How fast does it evolve?
Super fast. I mean, I think it's a little bit anecdotal, but it's a nice story. When my generation came into Formula One, so all of the technical doctors, not the medical doctors, we can't save any lives, but we feel like we are because we're in Formula One. We took over, and I think the people who were running the shop at that time let us take over because they could see instantaneous results. And we drove it very fast into a position where Formula One actually probably didn't want to be, because we automated everything. So we automated all of the systems in the cars and took the human element out of it. In terms of the driver, we removed further and further the driver from actually being able to impact on the performance of the car. So we took away the driver's skill, if you like, and we put stability, full stability control, full automatic gearboxes, full launch control, fully assisted braking, everything. The driver had to do one or two inputs during the lap, and the rest of it was done himself. And we took it too far, and that's because we were very young and very kind of tech-driven, rather than concentrating on the sport. And I think now it's been pared back to a better position, but we're still very, very data-driven. I always describe it as, it's like a business that puts, all the 10 teams put their P&L, they do their earnings call every 2 weeks. When you go to a race, you've all done all this work and you've done all this development and you've all talked about it, and then kind of the flag stops and the talking stops. The flag drops and the talking stops. And at that point, the timesheet will tell you who's the fastest and who's not the fastest. So it's very brutal from that point of view, and therefore that drives you to be super competitive and super data-driven. The tiniest of insights that you can get that drive performance and give you tiny margins of performance, we'll take.
When it comes to Formula One, I've always thought to myself, do you ever look at Mario Kart and go, we can make this more interesting?
No, I think you need to keep people like me away from Mario Kart. I think it's already pretty good. I think if we got involved, it would turn out to be quite boring.
I mean putting Mario Kart in F1. So Hamilton dropping a banana skin as he goes.
Oh, no, that would be good, yeah.
That would be hilarious.
Yeah.
I think you should take that back to them to do it. But because it is very much a team sport, and then bring it back to teams, because it does take a team to make this happen. And it's very interesting you say, because we don't think about sort of charities and how they look at data. How do you get data into the hands of those at your company that need it to ensure they actually get the most out of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the first answer is probably you think technology, right? The first thing we like to think anyway, years ago, we all had silos of data, which unfortunately lots of us still have. But how do we get the silos accessible? So the first thing is around technology, which my boss will kill me for saying, because we should always start with people in process. But if we haven't got the technology to access it in the first place, we're not going to be able to get the access to that data. It then comes down to people and process. So the technology alone is not going to fix everything. I think we probably all tried that 5-10 years ago. We all went out and bought the shiny new analytics tool or visualization tool, and then we thought, we've got 3 of them sitting in our companies and nobody's using them, because we didn't necessarily have the processes and the skills in place to actually use them. So the pieces I always think come after kind of once you've got the good technology or alongside getting that good technology is getting the processes in place. So that could be, what are your data collection methods? Are you making sure you're actually getting the data that people want? So you could have, and I'm sure some of us do have, loads and loads of data that's sitting in a warehouse or a lake house, and we don't actually use any of it because it's not relevant to what we do. So the relevancy is really important, because if it's not relevant, people aren't going to try and access it. We also need to support people with the skills. So data literacy is still a really big topic that everyone's talking about at the moment. If people don't understand, why do we have good quality data? What do we do with it? When I'm using a report, am I actually just, I'm sure we've all been in those board presentations where someone's picked all the data that supports their argument, but clearly it's biased. And, the first thing someone says is, you're missing 2020 there, you've got 10 years, why is that year missing? And it's because of, people are just trying to sell the story they want. So the skills around data literacy, bias, ethics, all those things are really important for actually kind of getting people equipped to be able to use any technology that we then have to access that data.
Okay. So we go back to people, because we see people manipulating things all the time. It's the same thing with statistics. So how do you, because I'm assuming you'd have to go through all of the data, one, to find out which part of it's relevant in the first place, and then how can you sort of manage that to know that people aren't trying to manipulate that data?
Yeah, and it comes a little bit from kind of self-policing of an organisation. So what we have to do is almost set up the boundaries of what people can do. So we're kind of, if we think of reporting systems, we're defining things like what a metric actually means. So one of the people I'm working with at the moment, we talk about things called lap supporters. If we don't know what that means, it means different things to different organisations. So we have to have a consistent taxonomy or ontology that we actually then define our data with. So in terms of like it's, like I say, it's around about kind of self-policing and actually making sure, firstly, setting up boundaries so people know what they can and can't do with it. So actually, when we talk about things like governance groups, data forums, those kind of things, is actually taking people on that journey. One of the things with manipulation is actually a lot of questioning. So there'll be experts in the room, and when someone's manipulating data, and it's actually having that almost challenge culture, where you'll actually get people to openly say, if we think about things like investment decisions, you've reported the best probability that you could possibly have against that. So where's actually your evidence to kind of support the kind of the data that you're presenting? So I think we don't want to shout at people and start kind of saying you're doing things incorrectly, but it's really about setting the guidelines, setting really clear rules, and also sometimes I think it's about use cases as well, taking people through examples of where it's good, where it's bad, and why, when you do manipulate data, this is actually probably just going to cause you more problems down the line. So great, we've made this fantastic decision because we think the investment opportunity is, call it 100 million, but actually that's then turned out to be a 10 million return. That's not good for anyone. It's not good for the company performance. It's not good for the person that's made that decision. So it's almost a consequences-based, understanding why what you presenting needs to be kind of accurate.
And it's a good term to bring up. Challenging is very important because, especially nowadays, trust is very easily misplaced. Jason, what is healthy data, and how do we make that clarification?
Well, I guess that, if we humanize it, we sometimes think that data health is data quality, but you wouldn't say you're a quality individual. It's the same as being a healthy individual. I know you're both, but they're not the same thing. It's the same thing with data. Data health is not the same as data quality. Data quality is a part of data health, and so it's data health is about the overall functioning of an organization and their ability to use data effectively, right? And the things that we've been talking about. So, and if we're not, we've basically got data chaos, right? And so data health is dealing with data chaos. And so the chaos we have are some of the things we were talking about: siloed data, which is just disparate data, errors in data, inaccuracies, the wrong people having access to data when they shouldn't, data privacy, data security, and then also that organizations that are using data, they're actually looking at the right data to make the right decisions. And so if you look at all of those aspects, if they're not functioning well, you've got data chaos, and data health is the way to manage that chaos.
How important is data health with what you do,
Rob? Very important, like significantly important, because I think if you've got data chaos, because we've become a business that is so driven by data, if you've got data chaos, then you'll be constantly getting the wrong answer. And I think we start from the position that, our data input is very disparate. We have lots of disparate sources. Be that, the car the car telemetry data, which is born from the 300 sensors or whatever that sit on each car, the environmental data, so the weather data, the tyre data that comes from the tyre manufacturer, the timing data, so the circuit timing data, and all of this is running in real time and it's all disparate source. And the first thing that I agree with the point we made earlier, actually, that it's you got to start with the data technology. If you start with people and processes, you'll quite often end up you'll never get anywhere. So, one of the first things that we always do is we always look at what is the data architecture, because you've got to get all of those disparate sources and you've got to bring them in and you've got to normalize them and synchronize them and get them in a format that are easily readable by the sexy analytics platforms. And even when you've done that, you've still got to have these constant checks that the quality of data coming into your system, the packets of data that you're reading, is of a high quality. That you're not missing packets, that you're reading at the right frequency. That if it's GPS data, for example, there isn't large swathes in it as an interpolated, come up with some strange interpolation or some ready reckoning that is unrealistic. So you've got to have all of these constant checks to make sure that just when the guys sit down and they actually start the analytics process, which is going to drive better decisions in a faster racing car, that you've got a really healthy data set.
And I know actually your company deals with lots of different types of organisations, but the charity partners are quite interesting. How does healthy data play its part within charities?
Yeah, so I think it's not much different from other organisations, and kind of building on what the others have already said. Healthy data is so important for actually being able to do anything. So if you haven't got good quality data, but I think the other thing really for healthy data for me is it's really aligned with your business objectives, and for charities,
because this is the thing,
important.
because for pretty much every other business is there for profit, whereas for a charity, it's not there for profit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's still important. They have to make a certain amount of money. They have to fundraise so that they can actually then carry on the activities they want. But in terms of the health of the data for them is, and I think probably the biggest challenge for not-for-profits in my experience is around linking data to your objectives. So we think of almost data as that kind of, is that team on the side that they do something interesting and they're not necessarily linking it to the business objectives. So what we're working quite a lot with our clients at the moment is embed data into everything you're doing. So take that business strategy. You want to help more young people. You want to reduce deaths. Whatever your charitable mission is. What
would be an objective then, and how would you use data to drive that objective?
Yeah. So one of the kind of really interesting pieces in the not-for-profit sector is around impact. So people really want to understand what the impact of what their work is, and no one is really doing it very well because impact is so high on the maturity curve. It's beyond just kind of reporting the data you've got, even predicting. How do you say that the £1 million that you've spent on this programme has meant 100 less people have died, or whatever that kind of outcome that you wanted to do? So their data is really important to actually kind of make sure you're collecting as much data as you reasonably can. So, who are the people that you're serving? Who are you not serving? What are you... if you've got new services rolling out, are you actually evaluating them at a time? You have some outcomes that you're expecting to happen. Has that outcome actually been achieved? So that you can then ultimately, at the end of the year in your kind of financial reports and your kind of corporate reporting, detail what your impact has been that year. So, particularly in the economic climate that we're going into, charities are struggling for funding. It's going to get worse probably before it gets better. And the average person, there's hundreds of charities out there. How do you choose which one that you're going to give money to? Like, even if you took, for example, something like cancer, there's quite a few cancer charities out there. Which one do you give to? And you'll give to the one that can give you a clear, or generally you will give to one that you've got a clear message that you can say, my money is going to make a difference. You don't want to generally invest in a charity that you're saying, great, you've bought 10 new IT systems, but we can't see the difference you've made to the end users.
And how can we keep up with changing regulations around customer data and privacy?
It's a great one, because obviously charities in particular, GDPR came in, God, it's scary, that's like 4 years ago now, isn't it? That feels like it was just yesterday. you've got a couple of options, and I would say if you're a certain size, the default one is to go and actually employ someone who is going to be your regulatory person. So whether that's a data protection officer that's in-house, or a kind of consultancy type person that you have 2 or 3 days a month, that's the easy but the expensive way of dealing with it, right? Because you've got someone who is their pure focus is to understand regulatory requirements. If you aren't in that position and you're not that size, or you haven't kind of got to the point that you can justify that, it's kind of the same as how you keep up with anything. So, ICO have got mailing lists that will keep you up to date with the activities that they're doing. There's lots of data protection. Obviously, data protection isn't the only regulation that we've got, but if we kind of take that as an example, there's loads of mailing lists out there that will keep you up to date with kind of weekly and monthly, this is what's changing. Nearly all the regulators will have kind of when they're going to make changes, they will ask people to kind of comment on it. They want to understand what the impact's going to be. So keeping on things like LinkedIn, mailing lists, all those kind of things. If you aren't in a position to hire somebody to do that job for you, it's just kind of, it's a bit like keeping up with your football team, isn't it? You sign up to all the newsletters and you hear the scores that are going on. So that's what I would suggest.
Okay. And Jason, have you ever experienced an incident of data being non-compliant with regulations, and how did you resolve that?
Yeah, I guess if we're in a court, I'd plead the fifth, but we're all friends here, so I can...
Tell us what you did.
Tell the dirty secrets, right? So, actually, it's a lot of it's around regulation, and it's not always easy to design systems in advance of regulations coming in. So, like you talked about GDPR, for example, legacy systems had to be changed to adapt to that. So, I went through a similar thing. In California, they have something very similar to GDPR. It's the California Consumer Privacy Act. And it means basically that as a consumer, if you take your vehicle to go and get repaired, or you rent a car, or you go buy a car, you could go back to that service point and after the transaction and say, please erase all of my data, and you've got 45 days to do it. And they can ask for an extension or whatever to 90 days. But basically, go through everything that you've got and get rid of me from every system that you have. And I was working at a company that provided solutions for automotive. And we had a lot of consumer data. And because we needed it to provide the services that we had. However, all of that data resided in all different systems. We had credit card data here and all kinds of, I knew by association where somebody lived and where somebody worked just by looking at GPS data. You have hotspots and you can tell infer a lot of things. So when somebody approached us and said, please delete all of our data, we're like scratching our heads, like, how can we do this in 45 days? We might be able to accomplish it in 6 months, because these companies like this exist for years. So it was a real challenge, and I think a lot of companies had this issue. So we had to go and re-architect our entire platform to be able to adjust to the regulations. And so we were non-compliant for some time. And I think in those scenarios where regulation causes those sorts of problems, you usually get some sort of grace period, so long as you're showing that you're on a path to be compliant. And so even being out of compliance and all things, and that happens with all kinds of audits, is that you just want to show that you're making efforts to become compliant and you're respecting whatever the regulation is, or that you're trying to follow. And so, yeah, I've been non-compliant, and probably in other things too, but that was the most recent one has been challenging.
Rob, how do you balance agility and control when making decisions? How does data help you know when to shift gears? Everyone's favourite.
By its very nature, you've got to be super agile. But then I've also just talked for the last 20 odd minutes about how super data driven we are and how all decision making is really, really objective. But honestly, I think, I talked a little bit earlier about how data technology is so important. But I also agree with your boss that people and processes is also really important as well. So you do need good process, but within that process, you've got to be able to allow the decision makers to make fast decisions. So essentially, we always view it, whether it's in a Formula One context or other data strategies that we do in other sectors. Essentially, what does data do when you boil it all down and you get out of the kind of the very geeky level of data science? data should help your decision makers drive to better decisions, right? There's almost a pun there, I think, drive to better decisions, no? Not feeling it?
There's a pun there.
Yeah?
It's them that didn't feel it. You got to sell it to them.
So, and I think that if you've got really high quality data and really good systems, and that are this mixture of simulation and data analytics, and out of that is coming a really clear direction, then you can then have a really agile system on top of that of people and process that can make fast decisions. So literally in Formula One, we have to make things change. So there's market forces, if you like, during a Formula One race that will change, and you have to make a decision within seconds. So you can't have a cumbersome system of either your data architecture or your people and process. The whole thing has to work seamlessly. And I think that's something that, we as an industry, we've worked really hard on. You see that it's a very competitive environment between all the teams. And sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. In Formula One, the decision making is so fast and so critical that we always say if you get it right 8 times out of 10, then you're doing a fairly good job. There's certain teams at the moment who've probably swapped that ratio. But
and Ashley, do you have an example of how you've used data to get the business back on track?
Yeah, so one example...
Nice. Yeah.
Because of the Formula One.
No, I get it. They got it. The track.
So one example is quite an interesting company. I won't mention names because I'll get in trouble. But in terms of...
What does it rhyme with?
Yeah, I can't think of one that would rhyme with actually. But it's a company that they sell really high value items, and it's really public. It's really kind of they sell items and it's in the newspapers the next day, and it's it's a really big thing.
Rhymes with Bappel.
Microsoft.
It's a very different industry. But one of the things that was really interesting...
Chewy Vuitton.
That sounds like a dog company. That's a new dog toy range.
Was it Poochie?
So
we're going to guess. We're going to guess.
Grada.
We've been here all day now.
This company...
Smikey.
They would sell these really high value items
Radidas.
on the paper. The people that sold these... I'm just going to carry on. The people that sold these items were their bonuses were dependent on how much they were selling things for. So... From the outset, it looks like they're doing really well. All these big bonuses are being paid. Everyone's really happy. But actually, when you actually dug down into it, it's very much that the high-value items were actually losing money, because what they hadn't necessarily looked at was profitability. They just looked at income. So to get these big high-value sales, people were kind of doing other deals, not bad deals, just they were kind of discounting things, offering money back in a legal way onto these items being sold, which was okay for a couple of items, because if you're doing that to be on the paper and get the publicity, that's okay, but as long as it's a decision that's being made. But what they weren't realising is actually on a lot of the items they thought they were making money on, they were actually losing money on. So one of the things we did was go in and actually look at them and work out what the profitability was rather than what the income was. And it's fair to say it wasn't very popular with the people who were selling, whose bonuses were dropped slightly because it wasn't quite what they thought it was. But it was really important to understand that, that top level number, that's the really big publicity number, wasn't actually making your business successful. In fact, it was actually really harming them in the end.
Okay. And Jason, is there a way to future-proof your data to help the business stay ahead of the curve?
Corner.
Okay.
Curve. Yeah.
I think you've just about hit every aspect of racing with your puns here.
Don't put the brakes on now.
Yes!
Did you put him in the audience?
He's a plant. That's what we do.
It's very good, very good. What was the question again? Future-proofing. Okay, well, I haven't yet met any kind of technology that is future-proof. But I think that obviously having healthy data is going to get you in a good position, and having the right topologies in your networks and having the right people that know how to use the processes and that kind of stuff, having the right team. but I think that the future really is about focusing on customer outcomes, and so for us, we're providing solutions that customers use, right? So for a business, one of our customers is about their customers' outcomes, right? So everybody should be thinking about who their customer is and driving to those outcomes. And I think the future is about a level of predictability. So using AI and ML to try to infer what the future can look like from that. And I think the other thing is the being real-time or right time. Because some systems you don't need to have real-time data, and it can be expensive to capture and process. And other systems you do need to have real-time, like Formula One. I mean, where would you be if you find out after the race, what your lap scores were in halfway? You needed that a lot earlier. So, having the right data at the right time, I think, is also going to be really critical, especially when we have a lot of technologies coming out that are requiring it machine-to-machine communications, like autonomous vehicles, where we have vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communications has to be real-time because lives are at stake. So I think when we think about how to future-proof your data, it's about focusing on the outcomes that you're looking for and making sure that you have data sets that you can retain for long periods of time, because you might need that as your large data sets for machine learning, because that's how AI works, is having large training data. So if you're already capturing data now in a healthy state, that means that in the future you'll be able to rely on that data historically to build these data sets and do your modeling. So there's a lot that we can do today to help us prepare for that, but it's really hard to say that we can be future-proof, but I think we can be future-ready.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes this first section of the show. We'll be back in a few moments where we'll be finding out a few more home truths about our panel. We shall see you then. Thank you very much.
Yes, Gregory, I hear your presence. The numbers are coming in now. We will be up 32% this year. Tina, the typing's a little distracting.
Leaving your business decisions up to destiny? There's no substitute for healthy data. Talent.
Welcome back to TLC TV. Before we get to the next section, we are going to play a fun game with the panel to help you guys at home get to know them a little bit better. This game many of you may have played. It is called 2 Lies and 1 Truth, in which each of us will give you 2 things that are false and 1 thing that's true, and it's down to the rest of the panel and yourselves to try and figure out which one is the true one. So, for example, mine would be, I thoroughly prepared for this by reading all of your profiles many times. I am quite possibly the best in the world at being humble, and I was on live at the Apollo. And it's up to you to guess which one is true.
The last one?
I don't like to go on about it, but yeah, it's the last one. I don't like to bring it up because I'm incredibly humble. So that's basically the nature of the game. Now, we've not gone through this, so I actually have no idea which ones they're going to use. So I'm going to come to you first, Ashley. And what do you have? 2 truths and 1 lie.
Okay, so I have bungee jumped in New Zealand. My granddad, when he was in the Navy, was bitten by a shark. And I am a very good knitter.
Oh, I kind of want it to be the shark one. What are you guessing?
I think I have some inside information, and so I think I have to disqualify myself because I think I can guess. I
think it's the shark one because you said your family was in. Did you say they were RAF?
My dad was in the Air Force, yeah.
Was that? So I'm going shark. What are you saying?
I'm going to go knitter because I want it to be true. Because I think knitting is a dying art form, like hand knitting, obviously, not machine knitting. But lots of people do that.
And that's where my vote would be too.
With knitting.
Mm-hmm. Knitting.
You're a really good knitter.
Just slightly. Oh, that is a slight. Like I can knit. I'm a decent knitter. Yeah.
Right, Rob. Please don't tell me you butchered anything else. We've gone from knitting to penguin massacres.
Mine's more banal, and I'm taking it from the last time I played this game, which I was just telling you about before, because it was a slightly different twist on it. So I have sat and had lunch with 2 British Prime Ministers. I have sat and had lunch with 2 US presidents, or I have sat and had lunch with 2 presidents of Brazil.
Oh, I want it to be Brazil.
Good link to Brazil from my past.
Yeah. I'm going to go Brazil.
I'm going US. That was an option, wasn't it?
US presidents, I'd say the same.
I'm going Brazil.
No,
We're all wrong.
British Prime Ministers.
Well,
There's only one US president and one...
Yeah, I mean, we've all had lunch with one. I mean, who hasn't?
that's nothing.
Just lunch and dinner. We went to a buffet. So it was 2 which prime ministers were there?
David Cameron and Theresa May.
Okay, I thought you were going to say Boris Johnson. I was like, how can you have a conversation?
No.
Moving back into the discussion of data, and how can you tell if your data, and this is open to the whole panel, how can you tell if your data is trustworthy? Like, what gives you the confidence to trust the data you're seeing, and what erodes your trust in data? I think we touched on it earlier on when we mentioned trust.
So I think it's the same as any kind of trust, like a human relationship with trust. It takes time to build trust. You can't just instantly put a data set in front of people and expect them to trust that it is accurate. So for me, it comes down to a couple of things. One is around data lineage. So do people know whether they call it data lineage or not? Do they understand where the data's come from? Because that's one of the easiest ways to build trust, is for people know where it's come from, what's happened to it, has it been transformed on the way? And again, you wouldn't necessarily use those words when you were discussing it with the business, but they need to understand where it's come from and what's happened to it. I think there's also a piece around almost a PR kind of comms piece around it as well, is actually kind of taking people through it and explaining what it is and why it's there. I'm sure many of us have been in situations where you've put a report in front of people and you've gone, look at this great report, you've asked for this, we've given you it, isn't it great? And they all go, that's not the right number. And everyone has a big conversation around what it is. But it's having that open conversation about, let's talk about what the number you think it should be. This is how we've got to the number. Because quite often, in my experience, the report is correct. It's just the fact that we've not then manually manipulated. So it's being able to be really clear and open. So I guess for me, it's quality of data, lineage, transparency, and being really open for communication.
And how does that translate to your industry?
It's entirely the same, and I think we're probably in a nice position where we have been reliant on data for so long that when these unexpected, data points do pop up, they really make you sit up and take notice, because there is that, there is that legacy of trust with data and legacy of building really, high quality data architecture that you're getting good data. So when you get that unexpected result, we're kind of at the stage now within our industry where we can trust it almost implicitly and say, right, let's get into it and understand why we've got that unexpected result. But to all the points earlier, I think that's how you build trust, and it is a time thing as well. You can't just put a whole lot of data in front of a business that isn't data driven and say believe these numbers, because quite often you will find that the data disagrees with what they've been doing from a subjective point of view for many years. So you've then got that cultural transition to believing the data.
And Jason, how do you approach quality control?
Well, I think sort of approaches the same thing we were just talking about before. Is you've got to have trust in the data and following lineage and all the things that we talked about. But quality control to me is you want to run checks and balances on the data that you have, and one way to do that, I think, is using what I call triangulation of data. So if you've got different sources of data, in and of themselves, they might be disparate, but when you combine those elements and infer an outcome, they can point to something, that an indicator. And sometimes you can use that as a check and balance against other data sources to see if things are aligned. I'll give you an example of that. So, for example, I was working on automotive products for a long time, and we were trying to determine the odometer without actually reading the odometer from the vehicle. So we wanted to do it just from GPS. Okay, and you know, cutting corners and things like that is not the same from a GPS as it is with an odometer, because of course with an odometer you're actually got wheels on the road and you're moving, and from GPS you're just taking points and you're cutting corners. So you've got this quality then of data is not going to be accurate. And so we ran a bunch of tests. You know, do you want to take a sample rate at every 2 seconds or 20 seconds or 30 seconds or 1 minute? And there's a cost of aggregating that data as well. And so there's a cost to the quality. And so basically it was trying to find the sweet spot of where do you get the accuracy from the GPS calculated odometer reading or the mileage traveled versus the actual odometer, and what was the cost of it. And so quality, you know, there's a price for quality. And so in that example, it ended up being about 30 seconds was quite accurate to calculate mileage without having the true odometer from the vehicle. And then the cost of the acquisition of that data was not too high to make it prohibitive. So I think when you talk about quality, you also need to be thinking about cost, because the highest quality systems are going to be the most expensive, you know. And we can't always do that. So you're trying to find this balance between cost and quality.
Okay. And lastly, as we approach the end, in the wake of global change, and this is again to the whole panel, what new opportunities do you see ahead to use data to mitigate risk and maximise performance?
Shall I go first? I mean, it's always the same in any kind of challenging environment. There are opportunities. You know, there is always winners in every kind of downturn. So I think data gives us the opportunities to kind of look at what we're doing and actually checking, are we doing it correctly? So where could we save money? You know, when money gets tight, you start thinking a little bit more about what are you doing. But I think also it forces people to think a little bit differently as well. So we might have great data sets within our business that we've kind of kept nice and hidden because they're great and, you know, they're useful for us. But when we start thinking about actually we've got an economic downturn, what are we doing? We might be more willing to start thinking about maybe selling that data. So where could we sell it that it might actually become an income factor to us as well? So I think for me, the real big thing is around opportunity. It's trying to see what you can do differently and how you can, and it's not easy, you know, but otherwise you'd probably be doing it already. And then the risk piece, data is really important around kind of any kind of economic downturn type situation or the uncertain times. I had a lovely workshop last week where we talked about strikes, high inflation, power cuts. You know, it was a really life-affirming day. But it was all about how do we make sure we've got the data that means if these things happen, to planning before it happens, how do we make sure we've got data that we can actually then take action to make changes with? So data is central to our ability to understand what that impact is on our business, because it might not be an impact on our business if we have a power cut. Seems unlikely, but it's possible. It's understanding what the impact is and then what we can start doing about that.
Okay. And in your industry now, so when we're looking at Formula One, what's the scenario for you?
I think for us, you know, we are as a sport the fastest growing sport in the world, thanks to there was a Netflix series. There are other streamers, by the way, but there was a Netflix series called Drive to Survive, and that made us as a sport and as an entity hugely popular. We went from something like 750 million fans worldwide to 1.5 billion fans worldwide. So it kind of doubled our fan base, and it's not exactly aligned to the economic downturn, but it is analogous that we could very easily. It means that what's happened is we've got a lot of changeables who've come into the sport as fans. So how do we actually serve those fans to keep them within the sport itself? And my business does a lot of this in terms of how do we use data to understand about those fans, about those consumers, right? They're a new consumer, so how do you get the data on them? You first of all got to go out and you've got to get the data. You've got to then sanitize that data and make sure that's high quality data. And then once you know what they want, then it's using the data to serve them as a product, as a sport. So it's making changes to the sport itself from a fundamental point of view, and giving them and serving the sport up in a different way. So how do you, for example, we've got an unprecedented number of tweens and teens that are interested in Formula One. You know, Formula One was always very male, very middle-aged, an ageing population, and that's all changed quite recently in the last 2-3 years. So how do you keep tweens and teens interested in Formula One? You know, that's a really different challenge to how you keep a middle-aged male interested in Formula One. And you've got to use a lot of digital products, and you know, you've got to make sure that you're getting the message into them, and you've got to break down the complexities of a sport and put that in these easily digestible packages. But you've got to then keep feeding back into the market and making sure that, you know, that's what this demographic wants, and that's what's going to keep them interested. So that's kind of, it's not exactly about the economic downturn, but I think it's very analogous to that. You know, it's very analogous to a changing market and a constantly changing landscape.
And finally to you, Jason.
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
So in the wake of global change, what new opportunities do you see ahead to use data to mitigate risk and maximise performance?
Yeah, well, obviously with data, you're collecting data for a reason, and you're either collecting it to grow your business in some way or to make it more efficient. But ultimately, you want to create better outcomes for your customers, or the services that you're providing, or the sport you're winning. You know, there's obviously an outcome. So starting with the outcome, I think, is the most important thing, and being very clear about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And when you have a changing landscape, those needs are going to have to change too. What you set out to accomplish is going to change, or will need to adapt. But I think also within the organization, that there's the two things that come together. The organization itself is providing all the capabilities, the underlying capabilities for data management, have to do it in such a way to be flexible and democratized of that data. We talked about, you know, how people in the organization have to know what data is available to be able to use it, and how they can use it. So I think the responsibility is both at the end of the business where, you know, the rubber meets the road. How's that one for a pun? Yeah, I got one in.
Because the road and the rubber and the tyres.
See, I've been waiting to say it all day. Finally got to say it.
Okay, stay in your lane.
Touche. So where the rubber meets the road, and then, you know, the business behind it, making sure that they're providing the right capabilities to those business users to be able to meet those needs. So, and I think that the two will really have to come together that way.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jewel, for taking the time to come and be with us today. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you, Rob, Ashley and Jason for joining us. You've been a fantastic panel. You really, really have. So to everyone else watching at home, we shall see you next time. Thank you very much for joining TLC TV. Thank you and good evening.
Yes, talk to me.
Leaving your business decisions up to destiny?
I won't forget about you, little Pete.
There's no substitute for healthy data. Talent.